Thanks to Miguel and the Latin America Working Group for inviting me. And you can get most of this information, actually some of it's not up yet, but a lot of it you can get at our website at cepr.net. And you can also sign up for, and if anybody wants to pass around a sign-up sheet, you can sign up to get one email from us where we will invite you to subscribe to anything that you want, which is free. We have a lot of publications, the regular things that we publish, columns and papers and press releases and things like that. So I guess the title of this is Latin America in Spring, although I'm going to focus actually on South America. And the idea is that there has been something analogous to the Arab Spring that has gone mostly unnoticed for the last 15 years in the region. Huge geopolitical changes. South America is now more independent of the United States than Europe is. And this, of course, was not like this before the last 150 years. It's a huge change. There have been international institutional changes as well that have gone along with that. For example, UNASUR, the Union of South American Nations, which has played a very important role in recent years in the region. And so what I'm going to look at here, I have too many graphs, so I probably won't dwell on all of them because it's too much data. But I'm going to look at some of them, is to show what I think are some of the positive aspects of what happened in these countries as a result of these changes. Because to me, this is what makes it so interesting. You know, I think that this region is really the only region in the world where you can say that progressive changes have taken place, positive economic changes, through democratic means, that is, through the ballot box. I mean, you've had a lot of positive change in China, for example. Hundreds of millions of people pulled out of poverty, and the world record, you know, historically, the record growth, the fastest growth you've ever seen. But it's not, you know, under a democratic system. And here in Latin America, in this hemisphere, you have had real democratic change that is really unprecedented. And so first I want to look at, this is, I think, the overwhelming cause of the elections that you saw, beginning with Venezuela and then Argentina and Brazil and Ecuador and Bolivia and Uruguay and Paraguay and others, where left governments have now been elected. And the reason is that there was an enormous economic failure that took place for over 20 years. It was the worst long-term economic failure in Latin America for over a century. And so you can see on this graph, this is just the simplest measure that economists have for looking at economic progress. It's just income, or GDP, per person. So it doesn't even say anything about how it's distributed. It's just how much growth did you have. And you can see that from 1960 to 1980, you had reasonable growth. It was 3.3% annually. So that was a total growth cumulatively of 92% over the period. And so that's, you know, that wasn't like South Korea or, you know, Taiwan, but it was enough to really improve people's living standards. And in fact, as we'll see in a bit, you know, if countries like Brazil and Mexico had just continued to grow the way they did, which was nothing impossible about that actually, they would have European living standards today. And so that's what happened instead was the next 20 years, a little more than 20 years, but we have it by decade here, growth collapsed. And you see there was there was very little change for 20 years in income per person, 5.7% over the whole 20-year period. And so, and this coincided with what has often been referred to as the Washington Consensus economic policies, or in Latin America it's usually called neoliberalism. So in other words, it was during this period, some of it was introduced at the end of the 70s. In some countries it was in the 90s, others in the 80s. But during this period, you had the introduction of a whole set of reforms that are generally classified as neoliberal. And I would include in this the, well, tighter fiscal and monetary policies, often pro-cyclical. That means you're actually slowing the economy when it's already shrinking or already weak, like Europe is doing today, for example, in the Eurozone. You had the abandonment of any kind of state-led development or industrial policies. You had massive privatizations. You had a kind of indiscriminate opening up to trade and international trade and financial flows. And other things that weakened labor, for example. And that's what you had during this period. And you did have, now again, it's hard to prove causality in these things because a lot of other things are going on. But you did have a collapse of economic growth. And that is, and you'll see in a minute, you also had very little progress on poverty, because it's very hard to do anything about poverty when the economy is not growing. When the economy is growing, you can at least have the chance to redistribute some of the gains from economic growth. When it's not growing, that becomes much more difficult. And so you did have a rebound in the last decade. And it didn't come anywhere near the 1960 or 1950 to 1980 period, but you did have a rebound. And part of that, I would argue, is a result of change in policy, but part of it is also as a result of a change in the external environment, mainly the growth of China and its demand for exports from the rest of the world. So here's the regional poverty rate just for the Latin America and the Caribbean. You can see this starts at 1989. And you can see there's almost no progress in reducing poverty, which is the top line, or extreme poverty during this period. It all comes really in the last decade. And again, that coincides with the economic growth that you saw. Economic growth finally came back to the region. I'm going to go through some of the countries that have elected these left governments and some of the policies and some of the changes they were able to make. One of the most important to me is Argentina. And that people don't look at Argentina as much, and they get really bad press if you read the business press, because they defaulted on their debt in beginning of 2002. Well, it was actually end of 2001. And they, you know, the business press has not forgiven them for that, and neither has the U.S. Government, which just yesterday got rid of their trade preferences for not paying some of their creditors. And the Obama administration has taken a number of steps actually against Argentina, which is very unfortunate. And but they did very well. The governments since 2002 have done extremely well for Argentina. What you can see on this graph, the darker line is just their GDP, real GDP growth. So they had this terrible recession from mid-1998 until the end of 2001, and then they defaulted on their debt and they let the exchange rate go. It was fixed at 1-to-1 to the dollar. And they got rid of the IMF policies that were shrinking the economy the same way, again, that they're doing to Greece right now. And they instituted a whole new set of economic policies, and they rebounded very fast. Within 3 years, they already reached their pre-crisis level of GDP. They pulled 12 million people out of poverty in just a few years in a country of then 39 million people. And it was a huge success story by any measure. In fact, this chart I won't even go through. It's just to show you that when when the press talks about Argentina, especially in the context of Europe, because they have to consider whether they want to go through what Argentina went through for another decade, or whether they want to, in Greece's case, for example, they could leave the euro and default on their debt. And the press always says, well, Argentina had a commodities boom. It was based on exports. And what this table just shows you is that that wasn't true, that the contribution, it was not an export-led recovery. Argentina was able to grow because they got rid of what economists call pro-cyclical policies, the ones that Greece and the Eurozone is implementing now under the IMF and the European authorities. In that case, it was the IMF in Argentina. And they were able to grow on the basis of domestic consumption, domestic investment. It was not an export-led recovery. That's kind of important today. And here you can see the declines in poverty and extreme poverty in the 8 years from 2002 to 2010. You can see a very big drop. And this is, by the way, not using the government's inflation number, which is not used by most analysts. This is using independent estimates of inflation. So this is really what happened. So they reduced both poverty and extreme poverty by about 2/3 in the last decade. They instituted a program, a universal allocation for every family with children, also recently, which is bigger than the programs even in Brazil or Mexico, the ones that you hear the most about, and it also has an impact. And they had a whole set of policies, which I won't have time to go into, but they really broke with the kind of neoliberal policies of the past, and that is why they were able to succeed as much as they did. So it's a very important success story. And I would say, you know, Argentina, Bolivia, Ecuador, and Venezuela, I would say those four governments are unique, or almost unique, I would say, in the history of the region and in most of the world, really, in the sense that these are elected governments that really didn't worry very much and haven't worried very much about the richest and most powerful people in their country wanted. They were elected to do what the majority, what the voters wanted. That's how they saw their governments, all four of those countries, I would say. And this is very rare without an armed revolution. And you know, if you just think of the United States, for example, where the pharmaceutical industry and the insurance industry have a veto over healthcare reform, and Wall Street has a veto over financial reform, this is a very different kind of democracy. And it's not respected, I have to say, very much in Washington. You know, if you read most of what is written about these governments, it's mostly bad. And it's mostly, you know, populism is what they refer to it as. And you know, for the last decade, all the establishment organizations in Washington and in most of the media have just been waiting for all of these governments to collapse. And their economies collapse. And collapse was always just around the corner. You know, when Argentina you know, defaulted on their debt and changed their policies, for 3 years, the business press was saying it's all going to fall apart. You know, and it didn't happen. They just kept growing for 9 years, except for there was a slight dip during the world recession. But again, every one of these countries has that kind of a story where in the face of, you know, almost universal criticism and bad press, you'll see they did quite well. Brazil is the only exception in the sense they did pretty well, but they didn't get the bad press. For various reasons. And here you can see there was actually also a big decline in inequality in Argentina. And so this is the ratio of income from of the 95th percentile, so the one near the top 5%, versus the bottom fifth percentile. So the bottom 5%, not the bottom 5%, but the actual right at the 5th percentile. So this is rich, you know, rich versus poor. And ratio, and it fell from about 34 to around 17 during this period. Now that's also unusual. If you look at the fast-growing Asian countries like China, you know, they had enormous success, pulled hundreds of millions of people out of poverty But inequality increased quite sharply. So this is kind of unusual. And they have record levels of employment, and you can see also on the right-hand axis, the darker blue line, the unemployment has fallen, of course, enormously as well. So that's why Christina Kirchner got reelected by what was probably the largest margin ever this year. Okay, Bolivia, this just shows their increase in GDP. You know, in recent years, Bolivia was under IMF agreements for 20 years straight until Evo Morales was elected in 2005. And then they said no thank you to the IMF and have had their best growth in 30 years. But when Evo was elected, their income per person was still less than it had been 27 years prior. So it was not a very good economic experience. And one of the things they did was they renationalized the hydrocarbons industry. And that, together with the increase in royalties that began in, because they're a big producer of natural gas, it's their main export, and some oil. And so that was huge. That gave them 10 percentage points of GDP of additional revenue, $1.3 billion right away in just 2 years, and more than that afterwards. And of course, that was one of the things that they were told not to do by the IMF. In fact, it was in their papers right up to the time that they did it, saying that it would be terrible for the country and they would actually, they would lose revenues from gas if they nationalized, which of course the opposite happened. And here, this graph just shows that they also increased public investment. Not huge, but significant. From the public investment is the dark blue line, so that increased from 6.9% of GDP to about 9.5% in 2010. And this came at a crucial time because, you know, the world ran into recession, financial crisis and recession beginning in 2008, and the world recession in 2009. And Bolivia was able to avoid that. They were actually just about the fastest growing economy in the hemisphere in 2009, when almost half the hemisphere was in recession, because of a large part because of their fiscal policy, their increase in government spending, primarily on public investment. This map just shows you how the country was divided over this. I won't have time really to go into it, but you can see the Media Luna states, the ones in green, have a much lower indigenous population. It's ranging from 16 to 37%, versus the other states, which have 79% more people, and their indigenous population ranges from 65 to 84%. And there was quite a struggle there, partly over the resources, the hydrocarbon resources, because the Media Luna states got about 30% of the hydrocarbon revenue, and the others got only 20%, and again with a lot less population. And so there was a big fight, and there was a big political struggle, and land was another big part of it. Bolivia has one of the worst distributions of land in the whole hemisphere in the world, like less than 1%, about 2/3 of 1% of the agricultural land, less than 2/3 of 1% of the farms control the majority of land. So it's one of the worst in the whole world. There was a struggle over that, and these states actually tried to, they had a kind of a separatist movement, and it got violent, and Bolivia kicked out the U.S. ambassador in 2008 in September, and things got actually quieter after that. They accused him, and they had some evidence that the U.S. was in fact siding with the opposition. And they still don't have an ambassador. The U.S. still doesn't have an ambassador in Bolivia, but they are expecting to reinstate that this year, reinstate ambassadors. But this is part of the story too, which I'll get to, is that the United States did resist a lot of these changes, or sided with opposition movements, or supported military coups, for example, in the case of Venezuela, in the case of Honduras, carried out a military coup against the elected government in Haiti in 2004 that was organized by the United States. And so this is a lot of the story as well. But I just wanted to point this out because the hydrocarbons was a big part of the story, and when the government got control of that, they were able to do quite a bit. And here you can see the drop in poverty and extreme poverty in Bolivia. Unfortunately, it only goes to 2009. I'm quite sure that it'll be much lower for 2012. These statistics just have a big lag. And because they really actually had a slow start in terms of the social programs that they had. One of the things they did, they lowered the retirement age in Bolivia from 65 to 58, which is very important because most people don't live to 65 actually in Bolivia, and so and they also incorporated millions of people in the informal sector into the public pension system who weren't before eligible. So these are very significant changes as well. And this shows just some of the changes. Again, it only goes to 2009, so they're not as big as they would be today, but it just shows improvements in sanitation, electricity, telephone, not having a dirt floor is the one on the right. So these are significant too, and a big drop in the Gini coefficient measuring income inequality. So these are changes too. Brazil also had some important changes since Lula was elected in 2002. This is the GDP growth over the trend line. You get an increase in GDP after 2004 in GDP growth. And just to give you something, here's another way of seeing how much growth matters. Here's Brazil from 1960 compared to South Korea. And this is just their GDP, actually it should say GDP per person is what is on the graph. And Brazil starts out ahead of South Korea, way ahead of South Korea in 1960, and with almost twice as much income per person. And they both grow rapidly for the 20 years. And so they're about relatively the same in 1980. And then what happens? Brazil, like the rest of Latin America, just basically stops growing for almost 25 years. And South Korea continues to grow. And South Korea today is a high-income country. And if you look at all the social indicators that go with that, if you compare them, South Korea is ranked 12 in the Human Development Index, and Brazil is 73. South Korea, average years of schooling is 12 years of schooling, and Brazil is 7. Infant mortality is almost 4 times as high in Brazil as it is in South Korea. So any of these measures you look at, this is the difference it makes. So it's very important when I talk about an economic failure of Latin America, those aren't just numbers. That's a whole, a couple of generations losing out on their chance to improve their living standards, and the country losing its chance to become a high-income country like Europe, like the countries of Europe. And so this is what happened. Now, in spite of that, you do see some improvement since 2004. This is their economic policy. Maybe I'll flip back to that in a minute. But I wanted to look at some of the improvements first. You can see their unemployment has fallen to a record low. Their measured unemployment rate, and also their employment as a percentage of the labor force has gone, that's on the upper graph, has gone to a record high. And that's just because, mainly because of the increase in the growth rate since just 2004. You also had, under Lula they increased the minimum wage by 60%. That affects wages across the distribution, so that was important. And you can see the wage share of GDP growing again from 2004 significantly, from 31 to 34%. And also the Gini index measuring inequality falling during that time. This is just household income, the increases in household income. Let me just look at the economic policy, though, that made a difference here. You can see in the, this is the primary budget surplus. So this is the budget surplus that the government is running, not including interest payments. And you can see a big drop in that when the world recession hit. That was very important. Brazil counteracting the recession. And this is what allowed them to continue to grow. Well, they didn't grow through the world recession, but it mitigated the effect of the recession. Unfortunately, you can see their, sorry, I wanted to go to the interest rate graph because that shows you the problem. If you look at interest rates in Brazil compared to the interest rate set by the central bank compared to anywhere else in the world, of course they're zero in the United States, you can see they have very high interest rates. That's one of the policies that has prevented Brazil from reaching its potential. It's a very neoliberal central bank, and the financial sector is very powerful in Brazil. It's a very similar problem what we have with Wall Street. And influence on policy. And so one of the things it does is it raises the exchange rate and hurts their manufacturing sector and makes it harder for them to achieve the kind of investment and growth that they could otherwise have. So that's one of the policies that hasn't changed enough, but you can see that it has changed considerably. This is, again, the central bank interest rate. You can see it's fallen quite a bit in recent years. And it's dropping now, of course, because Brazil, the government is lowering it because Brazil grew only 2.7% last year. And so the government has realized that they made a mistake in slowing the economy when it was growing. This is one of the major mistakes that you see, that you saw for this whole 20-year period, is governments, they're basically so worried about inflation that they start to shrink or slow the economy when it grows in order to attempt to reduce inflation by reducing overall demand. The Federal Reserve has done this in the United States many times too, prior to the last two recessions, which were caused by bubbles, first stock market and then housing bubbles bursting. Our recessions were generally caused by our central bank raising interest rates. And so this is one of the problems. Remember, I mentioned at the beginning, monetary policy was too conservative during this period. And Brazil still has some of that, but they've been able to make some progress in spite of that. They've had a large reduction, as you saw, in the poverty rate and a redistribution of income. Okay, I just want to make sure I didn't miss. Okay, we're fine. How much time do I have?
You're fine.
Okay, so I can't tell all of these countries' stories in great detail. But I want to go into a little bit. Okay, so here is Ecuador, and again, they've had well above trend growth for the last few years. And Correa was elected in 2007. They took a really big hit. You can see when the world crisis, financial crisis and recession hit, starting the same time that we went into recession. In the United States, they lost a lot of remittances, which was the biggest source of foreign exchange earnings. So Ecuador had a pretty tough time. Their oil prices, their other big source of foreign exchange, oil prices collapsed in the last quarter of 2008. And so they have the dollar as their currency, which makes it really hard. Because when you don't have your own currency, it means you don't have that much control over monetary policy. And you don't have any control over your exchange rate, which is another way, two of the three main policies by which you can recover from a recession. So they had to rely on fiscal policy in order to recover, and they did. They had about a stimulus that was maybe 5 times the size of our federal stimulus, and so they were able to get through the world recession with a relatively mild, a very mild downturn and continue growing. And they also did something that the business press has still not forgiven them for. They defaulted on a third of their foreign debt. And the reason that they incurred such wrath over this default, even more than other defaults, is that this was one they didn't really have to do. This was a campaign promise that Rafael Correa made to civil society when he ran for office. He said that he would establish a commission that would look, an international commission that would look at the debt and decide if there was any part of it that was illegitimate, and if so, they wouldn't pay it. And in keeping with the tradition of these presidents that I'm describing, he kept that promise and got rid of a third of their foreign debt. And it didn't seem to hurt them. And you can see here, what it really made a difference was not so much their debt, which wasn't that high, but the interest payments on their debt. Since this was high interest debt, it fell from about 2 to 1% of GDP. That's a very big change, and enabled Ecuador to have more money for social spending, which they did. Here's the increase in public and social spending. You can see it goes from 4.8% in 2006 to 9.3% in 2011. And the biggest jump is in education. The other big increase in spending, social spending, was on credit for housing. So this really expanded the availability of housing. And they also expanded other programs, especially on health care. Within a couple of years, they doubled the spending on health care as a percentage of the economy. So these are significant changes for a country that was pretty strapped. Again, they didn't have the freedom in terms of, or the policy space, we would call it, that the other countries had. And here you can see a big drop, or significant drop in poverty, in the poverty rate, a significant drop in the Gini, which is, measuring, so in other words, the income distribution got much more equal. Not much movement, unfortunately, on the extreme poverty axis. Of course, this measures only cash income. So there are still things, non-cash benefits like health and education that the poor are getting, but hopefully they will have more progress there. Here's Venezuela, and the Venezuelan story. All you hear about Venezuela is bad things if you read any of the press here. Has anybody heard anything good about Venezuela in the last 13 years? I'm just curious. In the press? Not in the press. It is really hard. It's quite amazing. I mean, it is the worst press coverage in the world, of any country in the world, I think, in the sense that you can write almost anything you want. It doesn't have to be true as long as it's bad. And I could tell you stories for the next hour if I wanted to about the press coverage, because I've been dealing with it for the last decade. But you can see here that the first 4 years after Chavez was elected, and he was the first of these democratically elected presidents, and when he was elected, most of the Latin American left, didn't even think it was possible to bring about this kind, these kinds of changes through the ballot box, because they had tried in the past and they were killed. And especially, in Central America, if some of you know that history, in the 1980s, and going back to the 50s, of course, in Guatemala, Chile in the 1970s. And so this was the first one to get elected and try to deliver on his promises to share the country's oil wealth with the majority. And for the first 4 years, the government didn't have any control over the oil industry. It was a state-owned oil company since 1976, but it was controlled by people who were hostile to the government and were using it to try and actually overthrow the government. And there were several attempts to do that, including the military coup of 2002. And you can see that they didn't really go anywhere until after they got control of the oil industry. And then you saw a huge increase in GDP. It basically doubled in about less than 5.5 years. And then they went into recession when oil prices collapsed in the fourth quarter of 2008. And they had a serious recession, and that was a mistake on their part. This is something you, again, wouldn't read because the press thinks of Chavez as always being too radical, but in this case he was too conservative, or his government was too conservative, and they implemented kind of what I would say pro-cyclical policies. They cut spending, and so they had a much deeper recession than they should have. So they haven't had too much progress since 2008. But you can see big drops, especially from the peak, but even from going back 13 years, if you look at the poverty and extreme poverty in Venezuela, and this is just measuring cash income, so it doesn't include the millions of people that now have health care that didn't before, whose government established enormous programs for health care, free university education, and also large increases in education at the lower levels as well. So these were big changes, and they had the biggest change in inequality according to the this is government, but the UN Economic Commission on Latin America shows the biggest increase in inequality. I'm sorry, the biggest decrease in inequality in the hemisphere. And again, you see these big drops in unemployment and increases in employment. And the government is now continuing. Of course, it's an election year. The government built 146,000 houses for people last year, which is be like 1.5 million in the United States. And they're trying to build another 200,000 this year. So this is continuing, and I think it will continue. They have 500 billion barrels of oil, and so even if when they make mistakes, they get a lot of second chances in terms of their economic policy, and the government's committed to these kinds of social programs. This just goes through all 5 of the countries. It's a little bit of a summary of the changes in national poverty rates, and you can see the decrease by annual, because obviously they're in power for different lengths of time. And they're all quite significant decreases in poverty. So let me conclude by just saying a couple of other words about what happened, because, you know, as I said, I do think this is very important. There were multiple causes. It isn't all just policy that did this, but there were definite strong efforts on the part of these governments to change economic policy to varying degrees, to change social policy. These were successful, and I should say that they were mostly opposed by our government here in the United States, which, as I mentioned, supported and was involved, actually. You may not know this, but it is documented from U.S. government documents. The U.S. government was actually involved in the coup in Venezuela. They were funding opposition groups in Bolivia at a time when there was when they were engaging in violence. That's why Bolivia kicked the U.S. ambassador out. The Obama administration did everything it could to make the coup in Honduras in 2009 succeed. They nominally opposed it, but if you notice, they never did what the Organization of American States did, which called for the immediate and unconditional return of the elected president. They never did that. They did a whole number of things. They opposed the OAS taking stronger steps to reinstate the president of Honduras. They also went against the entire hemisphere on the election in November of 2009 because everyone else opposed it, because it was taking place under a dictatorship and the constitutional president had not returned. The United States was alone in the hemisphere. And that's one of the reasons why, after that, the Latin American countries got together and formed a new organization, the Community of Latin American and Caribbean Countries, which had its first real meeting a few months ago. And that's a group that now includes everybody in the hemisphere except the US and Canada. And that was in response to their frustration within the Organization of American States, very much around Honduras, you know. When Obama was elected, all of these governments had very high hopes for change in US policy. And they were extremely disappointed. You know, we interviewed, I made a film about this, which you can get on Netflix or iTunes. And it's directed by Oliver Stone. It's called South of the Border. And when we interviewed these presidents, they all were expecting good things and big changes in policy from Obama, because they saw him as similar to them in a sense, that this was finally the change in the United States that, you know, they had seen in their own countries. Lula even said something like that. He said, you know, just as we elected a worker here in Brazil and, you know, a left bishop in Paraguay, and Chavez in Venezuela, an indigenous leader in Bolivia. You know, now we have an African American in the United States, and they really thought that this was going to bring some change. And it didn't. So I think people should understand that, that this was done really in spite of the US government. But I think they have now permanently changed the hemisphere so that it won't be very easily rolled back. I think because of the institutional and international norms and have changed, and the institutions have changed within the countries, because of these changes have been broad and sweeping enough so that I do think that there will be progress. I think we can expect continued progress. It's a very positive story. So I'll end there. Thank you.